afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. This is our second day of this conference. So I have the really pleasure and the honor to co-host, co-chair this track with Cece. My name is Ming, who I'm assistant professor with University of Maryland. I am architect by training. Do you want to introduce?
My name is Cece Doucette, and I'm a technical writer by training, and I have had a career shift in the last 5 years after I discovered there are biological effects to wireless technology. So I'll give you just a quick introduction here. That's me. And I used to be the former president of our local education foundation, and as such, I ran many campaigns to bring technology in for what we were hearing we needed for this 21st century classroom. And then a friend of mine who's an electrical engineer indicated there could be biological effects, so I began to investigate. And long story short, I became the first public school district in the United States to begin taking precautionary measures. Now, can I see a show of hands if anybody has an iPhone? Okay. If you could take your iPhone out, I'll show you a little party trick that'll help you to teach your friends and loved ones about this issue. So take your phones out and go into settings and give me a nod when you've gotten that far. Okay. All right, once you're in settings, scroll down just a little bit to general. And then up at the top, hit about. And all the way down, second from the bottom, is legal. So remember the acronym GAL, like there was this gal at the NIH who taught me this. So general, about, legal. And at the bottom of legal, you'll see RF exposure, which is radio frequency radiation that the industry politely calls energy. And in that legal fine print, the manufacturers themselves are telling us two really important things. One, keep this device X amount of distance from your body, or you may exceed the FCC limits for public radiation exposure. And two, use a hands-free option, like a speakerphone or a headset. If you choose a headset, go for a hollow tube or an air tube. Otherwise, the radiation travels right up the wire into your head. So when my school district read this legal fine print, I think they had a pretty big legal uh-oh moment, because they knew they had given the children and the staff iPads, Chromebooks, and other wireless devices with no technology hygiene information. So that's how Ashland became the first in the nation. And I didn't realize it. I just thought, I found a problem, let's see what we can do to solve this. And it wasn't until 2 years later when Dr. Deborah Davis, who runs the Environmental Health Trust, brought a panel of experts to the Massachusetts legislature to try and teach them about the biological effects of wireless radiation. She pulled me aside and said, "Congratulations, I don't know how you did it, but you're the first in the nation to begin addressing this." I was just blown away because we should all know this information. And I'm very excited to have with me today two people who I met through Dr. Davis of the Environmental Health Trust. Her executive director, Theodora Scarato, is with us today. I have one of the world's premier scientists who is figuring out the biological mechanisms of harm, Dr. Pall, and the retired president of Microsoft Canada, whom I met at the Massachusetts State House in 2015. He's traveled down from Canada to speak with us today. And Peter Sullivan, who has done many wonderful things for our planet, including getting mercury out of the smokestacks. He's done an awful lot of work around autism of late. He had 2 children who were on the autism spectrum who are no longer on the autism spectrum, based largely by removing environmental toxins. And one of the key things that I've been doing of late is I've had the privilege of working with a gentleman in the UK who used to be in the building world. He used to work for a really large construction company in the UK, and he was responsible for putting wireless systems into all these buildings. Somehow it crossed his desk that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine had put out a position statement to our school superintendents here in the U.S. saying that our schools should only be using hardwired technology because children are especially vulnerable to microwave radiation. And so it's kind of come full circle that I'm standing with you today in the Health and Buildings Roundtable, and now we know scientifically that wireless is extremely biologically hazardous. With that fellow in the UK, along with another one of the world's leading scientists, we've built a very little nonprofit. We've distilled all of the science on this, the international medical recommendations for using technology safely, into a 30-minute course for schools and families that anybody in the world could take today at Wireless Education. We also have another course built for the corporate safety induction environment. So although many of us today here are learning about this issue for the first time, please know there are many of us who have been working behind the scenes, for me for 5 years, others for 20 or 30 years or longer. And there are incredible resources once you know to look for them. I would also like to acknowledge 3 people in the room with us today. Dr. Lisa Naj, who is an environmental health medical doctor out of Martha's Vineyard, who treats patients who have already become ill from wireless radiation. I would like to introduce Libby Kelly, who has worked with the international scientific community and organized an appeal to the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and all of its member states. And somebody whose hand I have yet to shake, but I just found out Kate Keel is with us today. And she and Theodora Scarato have been working tirelessly to educate our world about the health effects that are going to hit us if 5G infrastructure is allowed to be installed in our community. So thank you all very much for having us today. And with that, we will turn this over to Ming.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think all of you are eager to hear from our speaker, right? So I will invite my speaker come in first. Okay, please join us. So while they are making the entrance to the podium, to their chair, let me relate this a little back to the healthy building, right? As I mentioned, I am architect by training, and from my education and also from what I have always tell my students in the first class of the semester is that the essence of architecture licensing actually is to protect and guarantee the safety, health, and welfare of public. So that is the responsibility we as a profession take very seriously. And also, at the same time, we are the profession, engineer, architect, and a designer. We are the profession always seek for the technology and to find out the better technology, appropriate technology to help us to improve public health. So in the next 4 presentations, you will hear how those researchers from different disciplines, different fields explore the usage, implementation, and pros and cons of different technology to the public around. So I'm going to quickly introduce the 4 speakers sitting here, and then I will leave most of the time for their presentation and for your Q&A session. So our first speaker is Dr. Braham. He is a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of Master of Environmental Building Design. Our second speaker is Dr. Choi. He is assistant professor of building science at the University of Southern California. And our third speaker is Dr. Klotz. He is associate professor at the University of Virginia and appointed by architecture and engineering program. And our last speaker, and very important speaker, he is a professor in public health, School of Public Health from University of Maryland. So without further ado, I will give the mic to our speakers.
Thank you. Yes, this is on. Do you have the clicker? So I'm here as trained as an architect and engineer, but also as an historian. So I'm going to do a little bit of, there we go. I'm going to do a little tiny bit of history, a minute or two, less probably now, because usually my audience is designers. How to frame questions like health for people who are working with a whole array of different factors that they have to consider in design. So to do that, I want to put this relationship between the built environment and health in a tiny bit of historical context and then jump to this one example. First, I have to make the point of the very first architect. We go back to the first architectural theorist right around the time of Christ. And at that moment, the first concern for health, in fact, just about the only mention of it in his treatise, which is our foundational text, is to pick a healthy site, right? Very sensible, something we actually worry about from a couple of different dimensions today. But I would underline the fact that the image of the body and the image of health they had at that time was almost entirely different from what we understand today. And to say that the way we imagine the body and the way we understand health as it changes through time also changes the way we think about buildings. Huge jump to the 19th century, discovery or the acceptance of germ theory, and in particular the scourge of those days, what was the most threatening illness or the most widely threatening illness, tuberculosis, which was caused by a bacterium, completely altered the way people thought about buildings. There's a number of recent books on this, but what they understood was in a very simple, I would call it very mechanistic fashion, that there was a germ that caused people to be sick. That germ could be killed by a number of things like ultraviolet radiation. Therefore, products like UV transparent glass were introduced in order to kill germs. Much of the look and feel of the modern movement, meaning architecture through the early 20th century, was influenced by this thinking and by this idea about what made people healthy. Even when it wasn't stated explicitly, this notion of fresh air and sunlight causing people directly to be healthy ran through the work of the time. Now, we live in a very different time. And I won't read this to you. I just cite a teacher of mine as an observer of the turning point to what pretty much everybody in this room participates in, which is the idea of the world as a system, the idea of the body as a system, the idea of the building as a system. I'll just switch to that. We easily understand today, although this really came about through the last 2 decades of the 20th century, that illness in many cases is caused by the complex dynamics of something including our immune system, that there are feedback loops, that there are threshold conditions, that there are tipping points, and that these things are as much a function of the nature of the system as the disease agent, whether it's a germ or an exterior condition. So that's hugely different. And again, particularly when I'm talking to designers, it's important for them to understand how different the buildings we look at today are than the buildings that were designed under that different way of thinking. So we now readily see buildings as systems, and increasingly they are as complex or resemble the complexity of natural systems with all kinds of computer-based feedback systems and so forth. And this is very much both in analogy with the way we understand the building, and as I think we'll hear in this second panel, also causes us a variety of kinds of problems. Now, my particular point of entry here was to ask, when did health become something that we could explicitly put as a criteria for design? The earliest example I can find, a favorite writer of mine, Frederick Kiesler, an architect from the first half of the century, writing here in the 1930s. He was hanging out with Buckminster Fuller in those days, and their collective concern, the group that they were in, was to understand how technologies evolved, how one tool turned into another tool, and how complex technological systems turned into more complex technological systems. It was in that context, asking how do tools develop their simple formulation, the one that they then were criticizing was that people develop new needs, right? I need to cut butter instead of killing somebody, so I develop a new knife. Following that chain of thinking, he said, the ultimate criteria of design, the ultimate need for design is health. Now that's a terrifically radical notion, particularly at that time, even though we had been concerned with the health effects of the built environment since right, since we began building. The single most powerful diagram I can show you comes from that work of his, in which he tries to explain why this is complicated, why this is a different kind of design problem than simply killing bad germs so that we don't get diseases. And he showed this diagram. The black dot in the center is meant to represent men. And then he said that there were 3 co-real environments. The term we would use today is co-realism. Is coevolution, meaning that these are each somewhat separate environments that evolve according to their own internal dynamics and influence one another and obviously create the condition for us. The biggest category is the natural environment. We accept that evolves, species evolves, ecosystems evolve, and so forth. Second, he suggested the human or social and cultural environment, and yes, that evolves too. We live in much more complex social arrangements now than we did when we were hunter-gatherers. And finally, technological environment, which I think it's almost a commonplace to talk about that evolving these days, right? When I woke up last week, the first thought in my mind wasn't, what I really need today is a new Android operating system, and yet my phone was presenting me with one. It was not solving a problem I had, and in fact, it changed a couple of things I kind of missed. But it was both answering larger requirements of the system, whether they're good for me or not, and advancing the collective agenda of that system. So it was that independent and also interacting evolution of these different environments that he saw as the challenge for designing for health. Just to put a word on it, he made what I view as a critical shift from saying health is a need, making it sound like a product or a service that you simply deliver, and said health in a way becomes the criterion for design, right? Health is very difficult to define. Health is almost always defined in the negative, right? It's the absence of a bunch of things, or it's the capacity to deal with assaults and changes and so forth over time. But putting out a criteria like that raises the bar, changes the way in which we think about design, and of course, for designers, makes it quite challenging to know where to start, because this is not single causal. Almost every interesting health-related problem doesn't stem from a single cause. If it does, we probably already dealt with it. And so we're dealing then with these multi-causal, sometimes system effects that change the question for designers. We have, over the last bunch of years, we've changed that diagram to make it a bit more contemporary, maybe I would say a bit more realistic. First of all, recognizing that the biogeosphere, or the geobiosphere, is in fact the context for all of the systems of life on the planet. So that subsumes everything and is driven by the availability of resources and energy and so forth. The human and cultural environment, of course, rests within that, relies on it, and evolves according to its own dynamics. And then the question that philosophers of technology have wrestled with in different ways for a century is, to what degree do the technologies that we deal with, and in this case I'm primarily thinking about buildings, but it includes my smartphone as well, how much do those things rise up and advance according to our needs, and how much do they have their own momentum, we'll call it? How much do they pursue their own agenda, even though they have no consciousness and no ability? But how much as a system do they further the needs of those devices? Now, I'll kind of pull this all together and finish up by saying we've spent quite a bit of time not putting health as the first question, but trying to be clear about all of the resource flows, exchanges, energy sources, basically asking what are all the things that pass through and in buildings, and how does that help us understand it? We've been using a technique developed by systems ecologists, using essentially a cumulative measurement of expended work and resources called emergy, which is really a way to give a picture of the system within which buildings operate, so that we can understand better as designer where opportunities for efficiencies are, where opportunities for improvements are, and then in thinking about this conference, how can we frame the question of health in a way that is useful to designers? I will make one last grab from that article by Kiesler in 1939. He used again, he's coining terms, he's inventing this language himself. It doesn't exist yet, but he said, okay, health is a criteria, that's a little ambiguous. it is ultimately the resistance capacity of an individual that is at issue, right? Health is the ability of a person to recover from or fend off or deal with the assaults of their environment. It's what we would today call resilience. And in fact, I think for designers, this helps to bring together a bunch of parallel discussions in the built environment. How can we take a lot of the thinking that's gone into resilience design, which thinks about larger scale disasters, and think about it at the scale of people and of buildings. I will only wave this diagram up there, not explain it, because I assume most of you have seen it. Holling's very famous adaptive cycle, developed originally to describe ecosystems, applied to everything now from social systems and corporations to human health. The basic message being that a healthy system of whatever kind is not static, but is in fact constantly cycling through, in some cases growing and expanding its capacities, and in other cases losing that capacity. And the critical factor for its, we'll say, health and its survival is its ability to rebuild, restore, heal, and move forward, what I've flagged there as resilience. And that is almost always, I'm not the expert on health here, so there's others who can add to this, but that almost always means having sufficient resources, whether that's information, food, energy, you name it, but having sufficient resources to cope with the assault that the individual or the community is encountering. So I won't dwell on this because I did this, we put this presentation together a week ago, and I thought to try and, for my purposes, categorize the kinds of things that influence the resilience of individuals with respect to health in the built environment. My quick study in this diagram basically put them into three categories: that world of things that directly impact the human body, mostly that we consume, and that is huge and involves lots of upstream issues and lots of upstream possibilities. The things that are associated with the shelter or building itself, right? And this is primarily our job. If things are not, I won't say just comfortable, but if buildings are not adequately protecting you from the environment or not providing adequate indoor environmental quality, that's a huge assault. And then finally, a much broader, but often for us equally critical one is the particular characteristics of the location. Yes, I'm thinking about what Vitruvius said in 26 BC, but I'm also thinking about the difference between building in a wealthy Western world suburban condition versus building in a poor world rural condition. There are so many attributes that go with a location that change the design problem that we almost always have to begin with that and then focus on the next level down. I hope I made it. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I'd like to share some of my project sample in the theme of the human building integration research that I'm currently doing in my school. Actually, when I was in a college, I was extremely lucky to have an opportunity to work in a general hospital as an intern. So during the internship period, I was able to meet some multiple patients and their family members. So I was very surprised because there are so many patients and their family members complain about their patient room indoor environmental quality, especially thermal and lighting and those things. And this one is kind of some typical ICU or CCU, and then the other one is a general typical the patient room. The thing is that there are so many patients who are physically limited. So it means that there's no way to communicate with their caregiver or even family member. So only thing they can do, those patients, are just look at the very bright ceiling fixture all day long, just without doing anything. So it is a kind of a torture. So this experience gave me a lot of inspiration for me, what I should do or how I should do in the building science domain in architecture. So as you know, the indoor environmental quality, the air, lighting, and acoustic, and thermal and spatial quality, those are kind of driving factor for overall indoor environmental quality. So based on some quality component, we can generate a kind of productivity gain, health benefit, and also environmental benefit by energy conservation. So unfortunately, in an indoor environmental quality domain, we have only one standard guideline. So it means that even though we share the same temperature over here, so some people are very happy and the other people are not happy because it's too cold or too warm. So depending on the physiological condition of individuals, so we may be exposed to very serious thermal stress or lighting stress or acoustic stress because that even though our ambient condition meet our standard guideline, it may not be applicable to some people all the times. So to figure it out, so many smarter strategies like a city and some building and a smarter system and environmental control has been developed very seriously way. But the thing is that the human factor seems to be more isolated from the kind of some smart loop. So typically, in a typical thermal comfort model that we are currently using in a building industry, that we are using only the 6 parameters from humidity to metabolic rate, and other parameters are totally not considered in the thermal comfort model. It means that in terms of thermal comfort prediction model, their accuracy is much lower. So for example, BMI, body mass index, that is really important. So body mass index is relevant to our fat layer. So actually, since I married my wife, she's a really skinny lady, and I'm exactly double than her. And then I have a lot of some fat layer. It means that it can protect my heat loss even during the winter season. So in terms of that, I'm very proud of my fat layer because I can save a lot of energy because that I can stay in a lower set point temperature setting in a winter season. So my wife always teasing me with saying that you have a double skin facade. So anyway, so there are a lot of human factors, hidden or unhidden. And the thing is that depending on those complicated human factor element, so our body can be react according to our autonomous nervous system. So based on the physiological principle, we were able to develop like a kind of biosensing adaptive environmental control. So it means that we are reading using the advanced some sensing technology. So we are collecting kind of some skin temperature, heart rate, and also electrodermal activity level, so that we can, using the sensing technology, we can transfer those collected signals to a thermostat, which has a computation capability, and then we override our ambient condition by providing cooler air or warmer air, so that the user can be stayed in a comfortable condition in a continuous way. So the thing is that in our research domain, the research topic, one of the challenging components is that we have too many different levels of skin temperature. The human body actually have a 2 body temperature. One is core temperature, should be maintained, and the other one is skin temperature. So skin temperature is always fluctuating, and also depending on the body segment, those level is always fluctuating also. So that's why we have to investigate which body segment generate most meaningful data, so that we can estimate the thermal sensation of individuals in an accurate way. So this was the interface that we used, and then based on the same principle, we tried to use some facial skin temperature, because the facial skin area is always exposed to air, our ambient air, and the other one is there are so many people complain, hey, if we have a kind of wearable sensor for this type of some technology, we have to purchase the wearable sensor, and also some other people mind wearing the wristband because of some allergy with some band or something like that. So that's why we try to use some remote infrared sensor in a remote way, so that we can collect the more instant temperature data from the skin, facial skin. So through the interface, we try to find some best spot or worst spot relative way, so that we can estimate the thermal sensation of individuals in a higher accuracy. So when we complete it and when you make it the research outcome successful, we can plug in the existing HVAC system so that we can provide the individually different level of the air temperature per workstation, even though we share the same space. So, and also lighting quality is another important factor in IEQ. And so, as you know, that pupil size is the most instant physiological response to our ambient lighting condition. So once we figured out the relationship between the eye pupil size and lighting parameter, such as illuminance and luminance, and also contrast ratio and glare, so we can do something to estimate our visual sensation in real time, and then we can utilize it for real-time control. So the thing is that at the beginning, I had a really difficult decision because I thought that my eye looks like just like this lady's eye, just an eye pupil size. I thought that it's exactly round shape, but it was not true. So some students show almost like a crocodile eye and a triangle and oval shape. I was very scared when I took a shot from the student eyes. So we tried to figure it out how to estimate the exact size of pupil per person because of a lot of diversity in terms of shape. So anyway, so we were able to figure it out using some more technical component, and we conducted a series of human subject experiment under the different lighting setting, different illuminance and different luminance and glare and contrast ratio. So successfully, we were able to develop a kind of prototype model, so control model, so using kind of machine learning theory and advanced data mining algorithm. So this is our team, and so this is a kind of some principle, so what kind of system we need to implement such a control. So it looks a little bit kind of, some people say that it looks like a Robocop, but I hate it. But we are using another set of sensor, which is kind of remote sensing for your pupil size. But for research purpose, we use this wearable sensor intentionally. So we target office setting, and the other one is K-12 student setting, school setting, because those young kids has even no idea what the glare is, what should they do when they have a too bright light or too dark light. So from the project, I was able to learn that, the interdisciplinary research is not optional anymore. It's almost like a mandatory these days. But the thing is that I learned that we need to keep communicating with people in different disciplines, because that it is the only way that we can find a solution to research question by providing kind of minimizing the research gap between some different discipline knowledges. So currently, part of the work is sponsored by EPA, and the other part is sponsored by NSF. Thank you very much.
So I was trying to think about how I was going to tie in the work that I do to health. My focus, I was talking to a graduate student a couple weeks ago, and she asked if I was interested in health things, and I said, no, I don't care about health. And I meant that in the terms of it's not the focus of my research. In a lot of ways, I care more about health than any of my research. But so I was thinking, okay, how do I make entry points into this audience and make the point that I want to make? And so, how many of you've probably seen this example, right? So it's organ donation, and the countries where organ donation is a opt-in option versus an opt-out option, right? So in the United States, when you go to the DMV, and if you want to be an organ donor, you have to check a box that says, yes, I will donate my organs. Other countries, it's the other way around, right? You don't have to be an organ donor, but you just have to check a box that says, no thanks, I don't want to donate my organs. You can see from the slides behind me how much that influences the rate of donation, right? So that's to me, that's a health issue. In these countries where you have to opt in to the organ donation, you've got kind of less than 20% donation rates. In the countries where you have to opt out, super high donation rates. Now, there's a lot of reasons for the defaults. We could go into the behavioral science behind that. But the point here is that it matters, right? How you frame these decisions matters. And the action part here, right, is while that's seems like it could be a really effective and inexpensive way to change how many people are being organ donors, right? So that's an example. It doesn't have to do with design of buildings, but if you do one thing out of my part of this presentation, I'd want you to think about how you could apply this type of thinking to create healthier design of buildings. I'll go through kind of one short example from my research just to kind of illustrate this a little bit, how we're thinking about it. So another kind of decision structuring intervention that you might be familiar with is energy feedback performance, right? So you may, depending on where you live, on your electricity bill, you'll start to see, here's how much energy you're using, here's how much energy your neighbor's using. And they don't say you're good or bad for using more or less than your neighbors. It just sets up this comparison, right? And they're finding that, kind of you can decrease energy use like 1% to 2% in a utility that gives this information. So again, super inexpensive way to change behavior and achieve some of the goals that you want. In this case, it would be energy use reductions and climate reductions, or climate emission reductions. So the other kind of point, in addition to thinking about how you can establish these choice environments, is how can you establish these choice environments in the most influential places, right? Because yes, it matters how much individual energy we use, but think about the people who are designing the buildings, right? It's one thing to change the behavior of the person who's flipping the light switch on and off. It's another thing entirely to change the behavior of the person who decided what that lighting system was going to be in the first place, right? So we've done some research. I won't go through the research, but basically showing that you get similar effects that you get in the other behavioral science experiments when you're studying experts, right? So we studied people who are designing big infrastructure projects, seeing how how decisions were posed to them would actually change the outcome. So one of the simplest tweaks we made was just, instead of giving them points for achieving better outcomes, we didn't take away points for achieving better outcomes. So didn't fundamentally change the point structure at all, just changed whether they were getting or losing points. It's more painful for us to lose something than it is rewarding for us to gain something. So we're kind of playing into that decision structure. 20%, about 20% better performance just from that simple tweak, right? So that's just a matter of changing numbers on a piece of paper and improving the performance. We compared it to, again, just to kind of hammer home the point of the cost effectiveness of changing these decision environments. You may be familiar with the Cash for Clunkers program, right? So that was a pretty successful program. It got a lot of cars off the road that were using a lot of energy and making a lot of pollution. We invested about $3 billion to save about 30 million tons of CO2 emissions in that Cash for Clunkers program. If you could tweak just using emissions as the metric again, if you could tweak upstream decision making for infrastructure by 10%, not even the 20% that we found, you would be saving orders of magnitude over that amount that they save from the Cash for Clunkers program. So again, the point is, these are speculative numbers, but the point is there's huge opportunities to be had here just by changing the decision environments to achieve the types of outcomes that we want. And again, I'll conclude with, like I said, health is not my area of research expertise, but I do think that there's a lot of smart people who are thinking about this, and if they can think about choice architecture as another tool, so the way these decisions are structured, think about choice architecture as another tool to achieve the outcomes that you want. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to be talking briefly about airborne infection transmission. And we heard earlier about tuberculosis and the influence of that disease on building architecture. But paradoxically, at the same time that it was having an influence on architecture in a direction of increasing airflow in buildings. For example, the original Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore was designed to have a strong stack effect to prevent transmission of airborne bacteria. The medical community was highly skeptical because, as shown on the first slide in this session, there was this concept that going back to ancient times, that it was miasmas and pestilential vapors that caused illnesses, and that this was debunked by the germ theory of illness. To the point that John Snow actually testified before Parliament that air pollution didn't matter because he had proven that all disease was caused by waterborne somethings, germs. So a little bit of information can go a long way to making bad decisions. And there has been sort of a disconnect between the architecture and indoor air community and the medical community about what is important about how infections are transmitted. It wasn't that, ironically, until the 50s when it was finally proven that tuberculosis was transmitted by airborne bacteria and not by other means. And yet that was when the era of antibiotics really came to the fore and nobody cared anymore. So in my work, we've been trying to understand how much virus people shed into the air and what is the role, particularly in influenza infections, of airborne route of transmission. And we have developed a method for sampling people's breath where they can just sit in a booth in front of a capture hood, and we don't ask them to cough or do anything other than to recite the alphabet a few times so that there is a little bit of speaking, because otherwise they might be silent. And we've actually had somebody fall asleep in here because it's nice and warm and humid, and if you've got the flu and it's the middle of winter, it's actually kind of nice. And what we have found is that people shed a lot of virus. So this is what we get from swabbing their nose, and we can get the geometric mean of 8 times 10 to the 8th virus copies. But when we look at the aerosol that they're shedding, we find that the average case is shedding about 10,000 to almost 40,000, and that there are some people at the upper end shedding 10 to the 8th or 10 to the 7th virus particles into the air every half hour. And we are able to culture these, and we find that there are some people who are shedding up to 1,000 virus copies per half hour of culturable virus into the air. And one of the funny things we found that is that, we talk about coughs and sneezes spreading the flu, but in fact, people with flu don't sneeze. They cough a lot, but they very rarely sneeze, probably no more often than anybody else. And we found that there is actually quite a different pattern of virus in the nose and in the lung when we dig down and do deep sequencing of the viruses. So that, in fact, when you begin to look at the minor variants present in the lung, that these SNPs here, we actually see almost no overlap between the SNPs in the nose and the SNPs in the lung, and slight differences even in the consensus sequence in the nose and the lung, such that we now may have a molecular marker for whether someone infected you by what they had in the nose and what they were exhaling in their breath. And with this sort of approach, we hope to be able to really nail down this issue of how are we transmitting? Is it from the cloud of viruses that's in the upper respiratory tract, or from the cloud of viruses that has evolved in the lower respiratory tract? And there's been a real interest in this problem because, there's the CDC has still says on its website that if you wash your hands and stay back 6 feet, you won't get infected. And so with CDC funding, we performed this study about 5 years ago where we inoculated people with influenza virus and then had them sit in a room for a few days with other people who were susceptible to the same virus, playing Monopoly and Twister and other games. And in this proof of concept study, interestingly, we got a 25% secondary attack rate. But there were no controls here. Everybody was unprotected, and it was done in a small hotel room on the periphery of London with, I suspect, they said they had sealed up the windows, and I think they probably only had a recirculating fan coil unit running in the room for air conditioning, and I hear it was a little stuffy in there. Then I got involved in the study, and I said, well, we really need to understand how this works, and we were going to do a repeat of this study where we had people wear face shields and wash their hands every 15 minutes for half of the exposed recipients, and the other half be unprotected, as in the original study. And we instrumented the room. We did it in a clinical research facility. We could monitor the air quality, the carbon dioxide level, the ventilation, temperature, relative humidity, and the room was very well instrumented. And half of the recipients were wearing these face shields and washing their hands every 15 minutes, and the other half were unprotected, and we had a monitor in there making people sure everybody did what they were supposed to be doing. We got a 2.5% secondary attack rate, in spite of the fact that we had more donors in each room. We had the exposure for 4 days instead of 2 days. What went wrong? Well, we measured the amount of virus being shed in the air. We measured the amount of virus in the nose. These people, although not shedding as much as symptomatic cases in the real world, on average, those who were shedding in the air, and there were about 20% of the donors were shedding into the air, they shed, a less than an order of magnitude less than what we saw with people who had fever and lots of virus in their nose. But we couldn't detect any virus in the air, as with using a sampler that the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has used, for example, in the outpatient clinics at West Virginia Medical Center in Morgantown, West Virginia, where they find lots of influenza virus in the air during flu season. And there were very few transmissions. In fact, there was just one that accounts for this 2.5, and that one person who was infected was someone who was wearing a face shield and washing their hands every 15 minutes. So, in fact, there is absolutely no evidence that flu is transmitted by direct contact or large droplet spray. The only solid scientific evidence is that it is actually transmitted by fine particle aerosols and droplet nuclei. CDC knows about this result. They've known it for a long time, but the website remains unchanged. So why is that? Well, I think it's because it's a cultural thing. This, in medical school, I spent a lot of time scrubbing my hands with a scrub nurse glaring at me to make sure I did it right. And allopathic medicine's original sin is puerperal sepsis, the obstetricians who transmitted streptococcal infection from a woman dying of puerperal sepsis to a healthy woman giving birth. So we have it burned into our souls that hand washing is important. And indeed it is very important, but it blinds us to when it's not the route of transmission. So we have been doing an ongoing study in the college residence halls at the University of Maryland, where we are studying groups of students living together in a close-knit community. And when people get sick, we swab them and assay them with a multiplex assay for 44 different infectious agents. We trace their contacts by cell phone, and we also swab the cell phone as the fomite that every freshman carries with them everywhere they go. Although I must say, some reviewers, when we talked about this in one study section, said, well, what if a couple of students leave their phones in their room and go have sex in the shower? Well, okay, so sometimes they don't carry it with them. But we draw blood for biomarkers and immunity studies. We have antigen arrays that have every known influenza antigen, and we're now adding other infectious agent antigens to look for immunity. We measure how much they're shedding into the air, and we instrument the bedrooms with carbon dioxide, temperature, and relative humidity monitors so that we can measure how much exhaled breath there is in the rooms and what people's exposures are. And this compares a couple of the dorm rooms early in the semester before kids in the poorly ventilated building figure out that they need to open the windows, and then they get more similar. We are in the process. I can tell you that the low ventilation building has a much higher attack rate by about 5-fold compared to the well-ventilated building across all respiratory agents, and that we have seen about almost 30 episodes of people who are either roommates or neighbors within the low ventilation building sharing the same infection the same week. We don't know if they actually transmitted it from one another because we haven't done the sequencing yet, but it looks like they might have. And no such pairs in the well-ventilated building, which suggests that the average, and all of these kids had pretty mild infections, which suggests that if you have a mild flu case or RSV or some other virus, that you can transmit it if you're in close quarters and no ventilation. But if you're in a building with even half-decent ventilation, it's hard to transmit. And that suggests that buildings can be an important part of making our communities resilient and resistant to the impacts of pandemics. Now, I'm not saying that if your roommate is shedding 10 to the 8th virus particles in an hour that you would be free from exposure unless you are living in a wind tunnel. But it takes more than just that ventilation. But ventilation is clearly an important part of the problem.
So we still have a second group of presenters. So for this first Q&A session, I think I would rather to give the time to the audience. I think we can take 2 quick questions if you want to make your way to the microphone. Any questions for our speakers here? Please.
Okay. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. No matter what the technology or science improve, but there's always a lack of accountability in terms of data and also the personnel. Their accountability and they're reliable for their performance. Instead, they always blame the good personnel. So the good personnel in the work environment may be so stressed and may be causing death. But the process is so bad and nobody can speak up. So I think in terms of health, we must improve this aspect. And that's very serious. And especially now...
Is there a question, my friend?
That's my question. How are you going to help improve the measurement of data collections and the performance, or improve the real scientific result?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand the point.
How will you improve the measurement of data and their results?
Sorry, say again.
What would you suggest would be some ways to improve the measurement of data?
Yeah, actually, so to objectiveness is kind of important, especially when you analyze some human user satisfaction and the environmental performance. So we are using the survey and also sensing measurement, so 2 ways. So, but the thing is that we need to increase some size of the measurement, and we need to increase the number of the user questionnaires, so that we can get the more data, so that we can minimize any noise factor. So, and also we can get a kind of robust statistical significance. So those are kind of way to keep some objectiveness and also significance.
Thank you. Next question, please.
My name is Henry Levine. I'm a guest. I have no technical expertise to offer here, but I do have 2 questions. One, in connection with a healthy building, the architect designs and so forth, and you have a green building. And then the condo board decides that their reserve is low, and they're approached by a cell tower company that will give them $30,000 to put a cell tower on top of their condo building. What level of education does an architect or somebody else who is involved in creating a beautiful green building, in educating the people who hired them that, look, there's more to this than just putting up the building. You better be wary of putting something on the building that might cause you cancer. That's the first question. Is there an answer to that?
To some degree, it's 2 questions. So one is, what does it take, or how much of an architect's job is spent educating clients? And I tell certainly our students that if they go into environmental design generally, they will spend a third to half their career explaining and talking with people about either what do you mean by that term, or here's the thing you need to think about. So it's a huge part of the issue. The second part is in fact, I think we had a great example here of hand washing among doctors. The certainty with which the time it took to identify that as a problem was what? Decades, centuries. It then becomes a thing which is deeply written into medical culture now and gets passed on rigorously, even as new information is coming up about other forms of causation that also need to be paid attention to. So I think there's, for the architect who's way down the chain here in terms of medical effects, it is the degree of certainty with which something can be put into ideally a regulation. Regulation has the most effect. If it's simply advice or it's simply cautions, it tends to be much less acted upon. And just to cite the slide I flashed up there of the evolution of technology, every technology has its time of evolution, but in the built environment, which is very conservative, it's hugely expensive and lots of reasons, the general rule of thumb is it takes somewhere between a decade and 25 years for a new practice or idea to work its way into common use.
And if I may just comment directly on the cell phone portion of your question, the scientific literature tells us that we should not have cell towers within a quarter mile of where we live, where children learn, and where children play. And for those vulnerable subpopulations like fetuses, children, the elderly, and those with an existing health compromise, the distance should be at least a half a mile. So for people who own buildings, please do not allow the industry to put cell tower antennas on your roof as a source of revenue.
And with that statement, I just want to keep us on track. And so I would like to invite a round of applause, warm applause to our panel. Thank you very much. Hey guys, in order to keep us moving, I do want to call out as our speakers are exiting the stage, we do have a tour scheduled at 2:30. So I would like to then ensure that Cece has time for her speakers. I will be returning up here to the stage around 2:25 to conclude the session.
Perfect. Thank you. And if everybody wants to just take a stretch while we get settled in with the second half, you're more than welcome. I know that Tigo sets in after lunch where the eyes start glazing over. So this is going to be an excellent talk, we hope. And if you just need to get your wiggles out, now's a good time. Martin? Hi. So we'll do Dr. Pall, Frank Clegg, Peter Sullivan, and Theodora. And if we could have you remove your lanyard, that'll go better for the visual. All right, so in the next 7 minutes, Dr. Martin Pall, who is a professor emeritus at Washington State University, he's now retired from a paycheck, but he is very much engaged in his research still. So thank you, Dr. Pall.
Give me a 1 minute
Okay.
warning, please. Okay, so we've got, wait a minute, I'm going the wrong way.
Oh, here. Sorry about that. Whoops.
Sorry.
I'll take your pen.
No, I need.
Oh, you want your pointer? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we've got a lot of work to do. Let me just say, on my, I submitted on the site not only my slides, but also a 90-page document that has documentation on everything that I'm going to talk about. So I won't give you any documentation whatsoever here. We don't have time for it. I'm sorry. The current U.S. and international safety guidelines, my pointer, are based only on thermal effects, but there are many non-thermal effects that occur at levels orders of magnitude lower than those allowed by these guidelines. So the guidelines are almost totally irrelevant to the actual health effects. And so what I'm going to do here is talk about initially 8 things that are extensively documented and based on large numbers of review articles that have been written. Okay, and the first one I'll talk about is lowered fertility. There are a whole bunch of mechanisms that are involved in producing lower fertility, and as I'll say later, we're in terrible trouble on this. We're already seeing huge effects in human populations. There are also neurological and neuropsychiatric effects based on 25 reviews. And if you look at these things, if you have time to read them, you'll see that they include all the things that almost everybody is complaining about nowadays. And we know that those are caused by EMF exposures based on many, many different reviews. We're already in great trouble on these. There are also cellular DNA damage of 3 different types based on 21 reviews. And these are very important for causing both cancer and for causing germline mutations. I think we're probably in great trouble on those as well. We have high levels following exposures of, I guess I'll move over here, of apoptosis, programmed cell death, based on 13 reviews. That's important for these reasons. And you get oxidative stress and free radical damage based on 19 reviews. So these are all extensively documented. There are still other things going on here. Oops. What's going on? Okay. You get endocrine effects, and a large number of different endocrine effects. As far as I can tell, every single hormone system in the body is impacted. And there are 12 reviews regarding hormonal effects. You get excessive intracellular calcium. And this, as you'll find out later, is the cause of almost everything that I'll talk about. So this is the underlying cause behind everything else. There's cancer. There are 35 reviews on cancer causation by EMFs. And it includes everything that goes on in the whole process of carcinogenesis. Now, pulsed EMFs that pulse up and down, are in most cases much more biologically active than our non-pulsed or what are called continuous wave EMFs, and that's been shown in 13 different reviews. Because all wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations, they are potentially, and I believe actually, much more dangerous. So that's obviously a major issue. So there are several other effects for which there is strong evidence, but not the kind of overwhelming evidence that we talked about before. There are cardiac effects that affect the electrical control of the heart. They are life-threatening. There's also evidence for very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias, and those are obviously very consequential. We also get ADHD and autism, apparently caused by late prenatal and early postnatal EMF exposures. It's my opinion that these are caused by the effects of intracellular calcium on the development of the synapses during the early development of the brain. So how does all this work? And this is my own work. EMFs act primarily by activation of what are called voltage-gated calcium channels, and I abbreviate those VGCCs. And so what are these? These are channels that are in the plasma membrane that surrounds all of our cells, and when they're activated, they open up and you get excessive calcium flowing into the cell, and it's the excess calcium in the cell that's responsible for most, if not all, of the biological effects. So there's several pathways by which this excessive calcium here work. And one of them is you get high levels of nitric oxide and superoxide, which react to form peroxynitrite, which is a potent oxidant, breaks down to form reactive free radicals, produce oxidative stress, and also produce inflammation via NF-kappa B activation. So those are all involved in producing pathophysiological effects. You also get effects through excessive calcium signaling over here. Calcium signaling is very important in the cells of our bodies, and when you get too much of it, you get pathophysiological effects. There's another way in which this calcium works. When you get excessive nitric oxide, it can bind to cytochromes, and that produces some responses. Nitric oxide also works via a nitric oxide signaling pathway. That produces therapeutic effects. There are genuine therapeutic effects of these EMFs, and that's the primary mechanism by which they work. So, so it's important to... About a minute? Okay. There are 4 reasons why EMFs are much more active in children than in adults. Children have much higher surface to volume ratios. Children have high densities of stem cells, which are very sensitive to the EMFs. The developing brains of the children seem to be especially sensitive to the EMFs, and the tissues in the children have higher water content, and that also is important in increasing sensitivity. For these reasons, things like Wi-Fi and cell phone tower radiation in schools should be a major concern. Okay. Several of these effects, I'll go through these very quickly, show cumulative and eventually irreversible effects. And so what that means is basically the same exposures produce more and more severe effects, and they become irreversible with time. And so when you have that kind of situation, obviously you're in great trouble. I think we're already very far along in terms of the reproductive effects and the neurological to neuropsychiatric effects, and probably also the germline mutational effects. And these each produce existential threats to our survival. Now, let's talk about 5G, and this is my last slide. 5G will entail the use of much higher frequencies and pulsations than our current microwave devices. The much higher pulsations allow 5G to carry much more information, but basically because of these high frequencies and high pulsations, the biological effects, I predict, will be much, much greater because of the activation of the VGCCs. The other problem with 5G is they're planning to put out tens of millions of these antennae, all over the place, so that it'll be almost impossible to avoid exposures. And so these are going to be all over. And the reason for that, I think maybe somebody else can discuss, because I don't seem to have any time to do that. So let me just say the current plan, which has already been approved by the U.S. Congress and the FCC, is to put out tens of millions of these 5G antennae, irradiating every single person and every other organism in the whole country without even a single biological safety test of genuine 5G radiation. This is, in my judgment, absolutely insane. Thank you very much.
All right, my name is Frank Clegg. As Cece said at the beginning, I've spent my whole career in the technology industry. So I'm in my fifth decade. That just not only means I'm old, but I do have a lot of experience. And I've seen the tremendous benefits that technology can provide if it's implemented correctly. But I can also see the harm that if technology is not used effectively and properly, it can cause damage. In my opinion, the way that we're implementing and executing and deploying wireless technology today is not safe. So for that reason, I got involved with, I actually was a co-founder 5 years ago of Canadians for Safe Technology. Our primary focus is on raising awareness and educating parents, teachers, individuals, architects about the potential harm of wireless devices if they're not used in a safe manner. Last year, I joined the Environmental Health Trust on their business advisory board for that same reason, to help advocacy here in the U.S. market. And also because Environmental Trust is very unique in that they also do advocacy and education and awareness, but they also provide funding and are very involved with carrying on research in this very important area. Fortunately, in North America, we are very, very behind some of the other countries that are leading in this issue. China, Russia, Italy, and Switzerland have guidelines that are 100 times safer than ours here in North America. In France, there's formal legislation has been passed requiring cell phone companies to educate people on how to use cell phones with speaker mode or earbuds to protect them. They've been very, very aggressive with protecting children in schools. Where in the lower level schools they've actually banned Wi-Fi, and you get into the intermediate, they're putting limitations on where the actual Wi-Fi routers can be in the school environment. 4 years ago, it became illegal to market cell phone technology to children under 7 years of age. Now, in North America, we eventually get there. It may take decades, but we do. Our concern is that there's a significant amount of individuals that are unnecessarily being harmed until our governments catch up and put more stricter regulation in. So things like asbestos, thalidomide, BPA, we do eventually get there. But as I say, in some cases, it may take 2, 3, 4 decades. Here in the U.S., the FCC issues the guidelines that industry has to follow. As Dr. Pall mentioned, these guidelines have not been updated in the last 20 years, and they're relying on science that's 30 years old. There has not been a complete, thorough, systematic review in either Canada or the U.S. Properly of the scientific evidence that absolutely shows harm to individuals from wireless radiation. We're stuck in this old theory that if tissue doesn't get heated, it doesn't harm. And we have categorical, peer-reviewed, published research, some of it funded by here at NIH, that shows that there is harm to humans without heating tissue. This is my special concern now that I have 2 grandchildren, is the focus on children. As Dr. Pall mentioned, children's brains absorb more water, so therefore they hold radiation longer, and their skulls are thinner. The research has gone back to the 1980s that show the average cell phone radiation may penetrate an adult's brain about 10%. It actually penetrates 70% of a child's brain. So as it gets, it's in the body, and it also stays there. There's other peer-reviewed published evidence that show if you start using a cell phone under 20 years of age, there's a 5-fold increase in your risk of getting brain cancer. We've done some work with a local school. I'm particularly also concerned that as we're radiating these children from the time they're in the classroom until they go home at night unnecessarily. You can download the data, you can work offline, but there's no curriculum, there's no discussion in the school environment about doing it in a more safer way. We did work with a local school in Oakville. We were able to reduce the radiation level by 90% simply by dialing down the routers and repositioning the routers in the classroom and in the school area, and the students still have 100% access to all the curricula that they need on the internet. From a business standpoint, insurance companies, as you know, they live and die by their ability to identify risk and mitigate risk and reduce the risk to their organizations. As you can see, back in the 1990s, insurance companies were distancing themselves from the risk associated with wireless radiation. Two of the leading organizations, Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re, have made very public statements talking about the potential risk, the unidentified potential risk from human harm, that they are advising their clients to step away from insuring companies from this potential harm. And also from the business standpoint, Dr. Sheckley, who is a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, is also a professor at the University of Colorado, issued a paper earlier this year that really challenges the business philosophy and the business case around wireless devices. In his opinion, and it has been proven, that wired solutions are faster, they're more secure, they protect our privacy better, they're more reliable, and from a sustainability standpoint, the thing that he really challenges is this continual business model where the industry, my industry, has to continue to upgrade. That's the way they feed their revenue, but it's also because of the technologies they're doing. Whereas if you put in a fiber cable network, it is stationary. You don't have to change that no matter what happens with the technology in the future. I am embarrassed and I am actually disappointed with the behavior of my industry. As Cece outlined, legally we're protected. So we have all of these, every wireless device has some sort of warning, whether it's buried 8 layers as it is in the iPhone, or it's at page 132 in the user manual. We are legally protected because we've told you that there is a risk that holding the device to your body, whether you put it in your pocket, whether you hold it to your head, or whether you actually stick it in your bra, that it will actually break FCC guidelines. Canada's Marketplace, which is think of it as 60 Minutes for Canada, did a study, and 80% of Canadians said they had never seen that warning, and 2/3 admitted that they held up a cell phone to their body. And that warning goes for baby monitors, tablets, or any other electronic device. I believe that my industry has lost the trust that we have given to it. There's no doubt in my mind that the way this laissez-faire approach that we've had that says, look, let the technology roll out, people will find new apps, people will find new designs, new uses, has been very beneficial. But I submit we have no idea the true cost associated with letting this technology go unchecked and unregulated or unmonitored. It seems like every week or so there's a new announcement about somebody breaching and losing financial data, personal data. We're still finding out about the Facebook issue where over 80 million people's information was compromised. Some of us may recall, but am I done? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop right now. Man, 6 minutes is fast. Yahoo got caught. 500 million users had a security breach. They waited 2 years to tell the market, and they ended up with a $35 million fine. I submit that in my industry, where there's billions of dollars of profits involved, a $35 million fine will not change behavior. So in conclusion, I'm challenging my industry and encouraging my industry to really step up and do this to regulate and self-monitor and self-evaluate this technology. I think the days are gone where we throw the technology out there, as Dr. Pall mentioned, 5G is the next one, and just hope that it's safe and hope that it doesn't hurt people. Thank you very much.
Peter, just 1 second. So, folks, I know that some of us are going to go on the tour, and in order to keep everything on track, including the bus, for the folks that registered or are interested in going to the tour, please join me upstairs at the very top of the mezzanine, and that's where I will meet everyone who's going to go to the tour. For the rest that are staying, please enjoy the next round of speakers, and then after the speakers are concluded, we will have a guided movement session and in the transition to the breakouts. And I just have to take off because of the tour.
It's all good. I'm Peter Sullivan. So the question is, where do we go from here? So we're going to talk about requirements for technology and healthy buildings. We basically evolved in the Earth's natural magnetic field. Unless you're an astronaut, you've been in this the whole time. So the Earth has a natural magnetic field that varies slightly based on lightning strikes. And the Earth we also get exposed to natural background radiation from the Big Bang, actually, but a very low level of it. Now, though, our built environments have magnetic fields and electric fields, dirty electrical noise of variations in these fields and harmonics, and a lot of wireless exposure. And these are dramatically different in degree and frequency, and they're constantly on, and they're moving in different directions than what we naturally were exposed to. So basically, we've got 4 different things we were starting to measure: magnetic fields, electric fields, dirty electricity or power quality we're going to talk about, and wireless, because the magnetic fields, electric fields, wireless radiation, we're starting to have some standards around those. They're conflicting, but power quality, something that Dr. Sam Milham wrote a book about called Dirty Electricity, is really one of the areas we don't have some requirements on. And I would say that it's actually, in the built environment, one of the factors that likely has the most impact. So if you have a lot of noise in your electrical system, you may hear lower audio quality if you're an audiophile, lower video quality. You may hear ambient noise, buzzing and humming. I think we've all been in those buildings. Have you been in the buildings with the buzzing, the humming, the harsh refrigerator noises? Yeah. You may have vibrations. So a lot of these electrical frequencies may become vibrational when they work with motors and other elements and transformers. You may see light flicker. You may see the quality of your light change. You may even have impact of air ions, because a lot of these field effects can move these charged particles in the air. Surprisingly, you may even have an impact of thermal comfort. So a lot of the frequencies that it can ride on your power in your building can be microwave band frequencies. So when we've introduced some mitigation, some people immediately feel cooler when we start filtering out some of these microwave band frequencies. That, essentially there's nothing stopping our buildings from becoming microwaves. Think about that. And so in electrical efficiency and cost, some of these high-frequency noises, again, change the power factor and impact the efficiency of the electrical, which is a big concern. And again, it also can impact just the felt sense of being in the building. A lot of these high-frequency noises create anxiety. It can create kind of a tension and stress in people that you may sense. You may think it's the buzzing lights, but it may be the exposure of the field effects. So it's nuanced and subtle, but I find actually about 95% of people can feel these effects. Maybe 3 to 5% of people can't feel them in sensitive environments. So almost everyone assumed this stuff was safe. I was in Silicon Valley. I was playing with all this tech. Some of the designers of cell phones are friends and acquaintances. I had everything first, if not was designing it myself. So we made some false assumptions about safety, including myself. I was doing everything I could to be healthy. I was eating well. I was detoxing from chemical toxins. I was exercising. I was living in a healthy building, yet I stopped sleeping well. I lost a lot of weight. This is a photo of me at 130 pounds. In 2009, I was 131 pounds, 30 pounds lighter than I was now. I was really weak, not sleeping well. I cracked a couple teeth. So it was a really tough environmental illness. I was exposed to multiple things. There are several people in the room who've gone through this, if not worse. And the final thing that because I trained early in my career as a troubleshooter, I was systematically going through everything. And I've luckily found Dr. Milham's book and started looking at dirty electricity. And that's when I turned the corner. I gained 10 pounds back in about a month after I evaluated that. And I've been much healthier ever since that. So again, this sounds very stressful. And it sounds very intense. There's a lot of things to look at and do, but I'll just give you the adage that awareness is more than half the battle. If you're aware of this topic, you're more than halfway there. You won't be blind like I was for decades working in this and suffering, trying to fix other things and doing everything backwards. So I would say take the time to educate yourself. There are a lot of good resources out there. Start turning things off and moving away from things. Obviously turning things off is one thing, but distance is your friend. Every time you double the distance, you reduce exposure by 75% for wireless because it drops off non-linearly, exponentially. And start looking for safer solutions like eco-Wi-Fi or hardwired systems. So what can we do for health and safety requirements going forward? Obviously, we need pre-market testing instead of making assumptions. These things should not be, we shouldn't have FDA devices going through rigorous testing for a 5-minute exposure when our buildings are giving similar exposures to microwaves or whatever, and it's just the Wild West. We need to work towards safe solutions, safe technology, and Frank Clegg really pioneered this field of working towards something positive. It's like automobile safety. We love cars, they can be dangerous, but let's make them safe. So we want to start, at least at the beginning, measuring things and mitigating them, and just comparing them to the natural standard, which is our background natural radiation levels. And for power, it's not just the wireless radiation, but when we plug devices in, they can create noise on our electrical systems that's distributed through the entire building. And then those magnetic fields go right through your body like an MRI machine, constantly. And I found these impacts can be much more dramatic than even the air quality work and the mold work that we've all done. And they can happen in seconds just by pulling a plug. So we need to obviously work towards no health effects. And how can we do this in a simple and safe way that's trustworthy? Because we have so many health effects. I think the Navy back in '72 had found 140 some health effects even back then. How do you quickly and simply test this stuff in a way that people can trust? So I think that's it.
Unintuitive. Hi, I'm Theodora Scarato. I'm Executive Director with Environmental Health Trust, and I'm so thankful to be here today and to speak after this great introduction to electromagnetic fields and health. And what I want to talk to you about today is solutions that are in place, reports that have been made, and with a focus on schools. Environmental Health Trust is a scientific think tank. We both publish research, do public awareness programs, and also give briefings to policymakers and governments around the world. So this is a picture of St. Augustine School, I believe in 2015, when they ceremoniously removed the Wi-Fi router. And there are the parents looking on, and there's a large news article on this that you can go online and read about. This is happening all over the world, where within individual schools or governments are making changes in schools, because of course children spend the majority of their time when they're not at home in schools, so it's an important area to focus on for children's health. This is a picture from a video extolling the virtues of bringing Wi-Fi devices into the classroom. It's Baltimore County School website, and I'll note the unhealthy postures of the children, as well as the eyes close to the devices, because we're spending billions to bring devices in, but we haven't built the infrastructure in a safe way for children to access this technology in the safest and healthiest way possible. This is another picture with children sitting on beanbags with the devices on their laps. And as was mentioned before, all wireless devices have fine print warnings that recommend, that talk about the radio frequency radiation exposures and how not to exceed our government limits which are outdated and 20 years old based on 30-year-old science. So this is some scientific imaging done by EHT and engineers from the Federal Universities of Brazil, showing the penetration of radiation into the tissue of a body of a man from a Wi-Fi laptop on the lap. Usually Wi-Fi laptops say, I know my PC says that it should be kept at a distance from 20 centimeters from the body, which is about 8 inches. Yet most people are not aware of that. It's deep hidden in the manuals or in the operating systems. And there are actually some schools where they are starting to ensure that the parents and teachers have access to that because of the liability issue. But if you take a look at this picture, and I'm sorry, there's actually an animation online. We have a YouTube playlist where the scientist is actually explaining this work. And I clipped this because we're using a PDF, and so the scale is actually 10 volts per meter. But if you look at the yellow, that's the highest rate of absorption into the body. Then it goes to orange, to red, to purple, to blue. So where a device is very important in terms of what exposures you get. And I'm thankful that I have been spearheading this issue with the Children's Advisory Council, the Children's Environmental Health and Protection Advisory Council of Maryland. And this is the first state body to make recommendations on addressing Wi-Fi in schools. So they issued a report in 2017 that the Department of Education should consider using wired devices. And most importantly, to all the architects and building folks and design, when you're doing a new build or when you're modernizing, that is the best time to put in the wires so that you can access the internet and connect your computers. So for example, if I were building this auditorium, you could actually run wires underneath so that each of these desks had a place you could just plug in your computer rather than using Wi-Fi. I'm thankful that my school has actually removed the Wi-Fi and they've installed ports. So when we go to the library of my children's high school, there are actually wires, which I love to see in the library. There are these Ethernet wires hanging, and you can just go and plug in your computer. You have internet access, but you're not having the radiation from that internet access. The Collaborative for High Performance Schools developed low EMF criteria in 2014, addressing 2 types of electromagnetic fields. One is extremely low frequency fields from your power lines, from your electricity. So you can address that by dealing with any wiring errors that you may have. You get an electrician, and they have an extensive list of actions you can take on that. When you correct those wiring errors, you can lower the magnetic fields. As well, they talk about best practices for devices, keeping them off the lap. And it's important to remember that all of our electronics have electromagnetic fields, and they have 2 main types. There's the magnetic field and paired with the electric field, the extremely low frequency fields. And then the radio frequency from the Wi-Fi. So if you turn the Wi-Fi off your device on airplane mode, as I use my device almost all the time, you're still getting the ELF, so it's important that the device not be on your lap. So even if you have the Wi-Fi off, put it on a table, put it off your body, put it to the side, or put a barrier of some sort, and that can decrease the magnetic field significantly. The Collaborative also has, where am I in time? 30 seconds. Addresses Wi-Fi to use wired internet rather than wires, and also to hardwire all your phones rather than use cordless phones. This is just the website of the Baby Safe project, which is a joint initiative of Environmental Health Trust and Grassroots Environmental Education, with attention to the published research that shows impacts on the brain, and especially because pregnant women are most vulnerable. The fetus, the developing baby, is most vulnerable. And Dr. Hugh Taylor, who's chief of obstetrics at Yale Hospital, presented his research that showed mice prenatally exposed had poor memory and more hyperactivity. And I invite you to take time to go to ehtrust.org and to the Baby Safe Project and to learn more. All of the brochures are in the other room, and I think my time is up, so thank you.
Thank you, Theodora. So we invite anybody who has questions to please come to the microphone. If you have a specific question for Dr. Pall to answer on the science, I would ask that you allow that questioner to go first because Dr. Pall has to catch a flight. Okay. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Pall directly?
No, I do.
Okay. Kate?
I do. Dr. Pall, the reviews that you were citing, those each of those reviews comprise a number of different studies, correct?
Yes, you need to have a body of evidence on things in order to publish a review. So each of these provides a body of evidence regarding causation of those specific effects, yes. Mm-hmm.
Then my next question is, you did also state that the pulsed microwave radiation is more potent than just the radio frequencies. These studies and reviews were on pulsed or just the radio frequency?
Sometimes on pulsed, but sometimes not. So you have to look at the individual review.
So it would end up being even worse?
It could be, yes.
Likely.
It could well be worse, right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I'm not sure if this is for Dr. Pall or not, but could one of you reply about the cell phone cases that are sold that are specifically designed and supposedly validated through research to show they reflect or deflect 95% of the electromagnetic radiation away from the body?
That's a great question.
I think those are supposed to be good. I haven't looked at the data myself, but yes.
Did you want to comment?
I mean, it can be controversial. Some people don't like them because it can reflect back. I do use one. My hand is pretty electrically sensitive. I'll feel little pricks in my hand. So I have a RF safe case. There's also safe sleeve and a couple other ones. And when I'm texting or something, obviously I don't keep it near my head, but I'll have it this way and I'll have the shielded part protecting my hand. So I do find them useful. I know some people find it slightly controversial, but because I get physical feedback and I know when it hurts or not, I feel pretty safe doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Stephen McFadden, disability activist. Speaking of unrepresented populations, I see no wheelchairs here, and I haven't heard universal design mentioned. If the wheelchair cannot get in the bathroom, then the apartment or condo is not visitable. See visitability.com or .org. This impacts not only the disabled but also the elderly. Lack of accessibility drives elderly people out of their apartments. DC has one of the highest rates of young disabled people in nursing homes because there's not accessible, affordable housing.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
Hi, my name is Shannon Roberts. I'm with Jacobs. I'm an urban designer, and I've been attending a lot of different conferences and talks on smart cities. And DC itself is putting in a lot of smart infrastructure in our community spaces, in our parks, which is basically embedding Wi-Fi routers within light poles and things like that. Planners tend to move in herds, so once one thing, the new thing is out, everybody does it everywhere. Anyway, so I'm just wondering what we can do to kind of educate and talk more about this as far as applying this technology universally.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and I think in our breakout sessions yesterday, it was kind of a universal theme that education is the crux of moving our society into a safer direction. As I said, I've had the privilege of working with some of the brightest minds on this, and we have formed a nonprofit where literally for the less than the cost of a movie ticket, you can take a schools and families course at wirelesseducation.org. We have prepared a second course for the corporate safety induction sector that's priced very, very low so that we can get the most people educated in the shortest amount of time. Each of the courses takes only a half an hour. So I think what this will do, one of my big lessons learned is I thought at every turn I would raise my hand and say, I think we have a problem here. And at every turn, not one person in my schools knew, not one person in my town knew. I met with our town manager, I met with our building inspectors. Nobody knows this issue is out there yet. So education, I think, must be the first recourse. And I really encourage everybody to go out to wirelesseducation.org, and then you can level set and have that conversation. And then come back to the table saying, no, now that we know this is extremely biologically hazardous, what do we know about our jobs and what we do? And let's start here. Because public policy, as we've seen with many other toxins, takes decades to catch up to the science. We're already decades into this, and now we're starting to see the cumulative damage to our population. I'm very pleased that Massachusetts is leading the nation now with 8 bills to proactively address wireless radiation in public health. But who knows if those bills will even make way this session. So I encourage everybody, start where you are, become educated. If you had a chance to see the film Generation Zap today, that's another very powerful tool that you can bring in for a screening into your home, into your office, into your community. It's been screened in libraries and town halls. It was even screened at Google this past fall, I think. So many good learning tools out there, but who would even know to look unless you and I in this room today start this conversation? So thank you.
To jump off of what you're saying about getting educated and smart cities as well, what Dr. Pall was talking about with 5G is what you're talking about with smart cities. And I hope everyone, just want to help educate everyone that 5G is the new technology that is going to tie together the Internet of Things, that will use and add to the electromagnetic environment and increase the frequencies we're exposed to. As an example of what's happening here, and Environmental Health Trust, we've been tracking in different states these new bills that are being put forward to streamline, to make faster and easier the ability for companies to put the transmitters in communities. So you talked about Washington, D.C., which is a test city for 5G, and there are actually several test cities for 5G, and there are many people coming together, getting educated, and addressing their elected officials and asking for this issue to be addressed and for any new technology introduction to be safe and to halt the 5G installations. So just here in Montgomery County, actually, on Tuesday, they are going to be introducing a new zoning bill, which I believe, and many others believe, is going to make it easier to put these transmitters in front of homes. They've already passed something so that it can be in commercial areas. And it's really important to also, I want to mention the letters. There are many letters written by scientists all over the world on this, on Environmental Health Trust, which is ehtrust.org. We have put them all together so that you can have access to them, and you can share them with your fellow architects, builders, and they also really concisely put together the research and the issue for policymakers. So I invite you to continue on this, but it's very important.
Very good. Dr. Naj?
Yes, thank you so much. So I just wanted to say that I really am thrilled that you guys all came here from so far away to make this statement, and thank God it's recorded. So forevermore, the rest of the country will be able to see these videos. And I wanted to mention building biologists. There are people who should have been speaking today, maybe next time, and they measure EMF and chemicals and mold in the home. And the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, which has written policy on the medical consequences of EMF exposure. And that in my practice, we see, as well as with Dr. William Braham in Dallas, that mold exposure is the leading cause of damage to the membranes, the voltage-gated calcium channels, that then makes people electrohypersensitive. So we should all be working together in this area, because some people know about EMF, some people know about mold, some people know about building, some people know about government agency policy, which is slow to change. And the idea is that by being invited to these types of meetings and being allowed to participate, we will be able to enhance education nationally. Thanks so much.
Wonderful, Lisa. Thank you so much. Yes.
I have a personal involvement with EMF. My wife suffers from it. We moved away from D.C. because they put something on our house, and she's suffering terribly in D.C.
Was that a smart meter by chance?
Smart meter, whatever.
Yeah.
And it was very complicated to opt out and whatever. Anyhow, we moved out to the country, to a village called Rectortown, which is near Middleburg. And I volunteer at a school, the poorest school in the county. 2 issues have come up. The county has determined that they will permit 5G. I don't have all the details, but a light post, there's a suggestion in Middleburg, so there's all hell to pay because people like horses and dogs and flowers and so forth. They're concerned about the visuals. Not many people are educated on what it's going to do to the people. I've just learned that they're suggesting in having a 5G tower in Rectortown, this village where I live. And they're approaching the school for a site. So there's so much. So the reason for this little speech is to tell you that I'm in the middle of it right now from a personal point of view and a community point of view, and I'm very interested in what the Trust does in terms of educating a network of activists. I would like to volunteer to be an activist, and we can come up, I'm sure, I run something called the Friends of Rectortown. We could come up with funding and foundation funding to get some stipends, to get people to come into our community and say there's more to this than interfering with your view of the mountain and the environmental, the visual aspect. Okay. There is absolute ignorance at the government level and the community level. And I know you're doing great things, but I have to learn how to get involved.
Yeah, what I would suggest is that thank you, that's very important. What I would suggest is that you get educated, and like I said, that little course is available. It's important to educate those around you before you go to authorities, because one voice is very easy to dismiss. So get a group of neighbors, a group of colleagues together, and then begin the conversation. Use the Film Generations app, use the wireless education course, use the resources at Environmental Health Trust. Get yourselves good and educated, and then start that conversation with those in a public servant position, because they have no idea that this is biologically harmful. So let's all start where we are and get the conversation out there.
You know, one of the things that we did with Hempfield School District, and which we do, is go and attend meetings and do presentations on this issue to begin to educate parents, teachers, and staff. And when people start to hear about it and learn this whole world that they weren't, you know, it's a whole new complicated subject, but it's actually quite easy once you start looking into it in the end, because our health is the most important, and people really come out from watching Generation Zapped and starting to use these tools, and then you can make an informed decision. And I think that is what is so important, is having the information so you can make a decision about how you want your community to proceed, what you want to be on your school. Having been in a situation where there were a cell tower for all of our schools proposed, we worked on this in our community as well, so glad to talk about that after.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for staying with us and for hearing us out to the end. Start where you are. If you all want to go into the Generation Zap screening room, pick up the cards from wirelesseducation.org. On the back of my business card is my personal research repository. You can go pound around to your heart's content. There's also a page in there for municipal leaders. You can print it out, forward it via email, and start the conversation in your own towns.
Thank you.
Thank you.